This is an example of our investment activities when we say that we want to walk the talk and as part of our investment program. So we collect funding from multiple private investors seeking for impact. And we've identified across a lot of our consulting activities with procurement and supply chain people and companies that there was something wrong in terms of access to technical and vocational training programs for workers and smallholder in large agricultural supply chains. And so accordingly, this is a program which designed basically content that is and hosted digital content that we combine with hybrid solutions to ensure face-to-face interactions with instructors, and which we disseminate widely across markets and cities, notably in Southeast Asia and Africa. Moving on to the discussion of SDG Washing. We thought we would introduce to SDG Washing with what's really at stake today. And what's at stake is, I think, something that we can explain fairly easily with the concept of decade of turbulence. We're entering a decade where we know that there is growing pressure coming from environmental, social, and digital disruption that is reshaping a very different world, and the decade that is just in front of us is often presented as a decade of delivery, a delivery decade where private sector is expected to accelerate transformation significantly to address really the challenges which are at stake. And then we can talk about climate change, we can talk about biodiversity depletion, we can talk about a lot of issues. And in response to that, we led a research we released at the beginning of the year in a report called Towards 2030 that is accessible on our website, and an executive summary is accessible as well on our publication section of ksapa.org. That is the outcome of some work that has been conducted in discussion with multiple stakeholders. As you can see, several NGOs, organizations, companies have been included in this research, as much as institutional investors, to really look at what would be at stake and where all those organizations should and are focusing activities and investments to address the decade of turbulence ahead of us. Of course, when we read this report, COVID-19 was not a global pandemic, that it has become in between. So the brief contextual introduction shaping what SDG Washing might look like is something that we wanted to calibrate with those broader perspectives. There are, in simple terms, really 6 priorities identified by all of those stakeholders that are really key to address what's for that decade of turbulence. As you can see, and many will certainly not surprise any of you, decarbonization, and in other terms, anything related to climate is key, and acceleration of formation of the way companies and investors operate is really critical. Another key element is water, and related to water quality and water quantity. A third one that is particularly interesting in view of COVID-19 crisis is deforestation, which of course is a kind of an angle of biodiversity depletion. And it's an interesting one because there are correlations that can be made across a good number of pandemics which have happened across the past 20 years. And I would name Nipah, I can name Ebola, and I can name COVID-19 based on the latest that is provided by science for what we know today, that there are relationships between deforestation in tropical lands and the development of pandemic. So there is an interesting connection there. A fourth one is circularity that can be, in some cases, reduced to plastics and plastics exponential development. And that's really a problem that has generated a lot of pressure from stakeholders and from investors and regulations on companies. And of course, the problem is when we look at that from the perspective of COVID-19, with the development of consumer good activities that people can use only once, simply because they want to avoid dissemination of COVID-19. The concept of circularity is a good illustration of those challenges we as consumers or companies are facing in those days to manage short-term injunctions, mitigating risks of dissemination of COVID-19, and longer-term objectives of clearly decreasing needs for plastics and single-use products, which is all part of circularity. But also, fifth and sixth of these sustainability priorities are no surprises related to social inequalities and COVID-19 and the big recession, global recession that we're in, and that is likely going to strongly impact economies for the years to come, is growing or increasing inequalities as much as it is putting a lot of human rights at stake. For example, when we're in societies where the monitoring of behaviors and interactions of people is development to mitigate dissemination of COVID-19, that is clearly intrusive from a pure human rights and perspective. So there are a lot of issues here which do call and are clearly aligned with the global goals and the 2030 agenda that are pressing, where there is good consensus across a broad community that these are 6 priorities that are very urgent. And the question today is the management of the short-term and longer-term conflicting injunctions, managing decarbonization, circularity, and others displayed in the screen, with the pressing and urgent needs imposed by the COVID-19 agenda. So in that sense, for us, based on our findings that we released at the beginning of the year, COVID is more something that comes as a problem which amplifies problems more than causing new ones. And in a way, to try to frame that from a more positive perspective, we could even say that science has been clear to explain why these 6 priorities were important. And to some extent, there is not much really new. If you look at that from a data and science perspective, and what a lot of experts have been saying for the past 2, 3, 4 decades, it's just growing. And COVID is, from a positive perspective, something which suddenly comes in a context where a lot that is coming with COVID is clearly something which could have been better planned, better anticipated, simply because, for example, and I mentioned already a few of those, there have been a lot of viruses which have been really a problem for a lot of economies just across the past 20 years. I mentioned Nipah. People in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Malaysia, India know what I'm talking about. In Singapore, SRAS is another one coming from Southeast Asia. H1N1 has come from it's a pandemic that has been developed from Mexico. Ebola has been a massive source of issue and killing a lot of people in Africa. So to some extent, for the perspective of business decision makers and policy makers, there's nothing really new and a lot which could have been prevented. However, despite the fact that something like a pandemic could have been perceived as something important, and everyone would have agreed upon that for years, no one would have thought that that would have could become urgent. And because COVID has imposed itself on the economic, social, political agenda of the globe, we can expect, and look at that from a positive note, that those sustainability priorities displayed here on the screen can hopefully follow a similar pathway, and that going forward, people and business policy makers, the business decision makers will look at those not exclusively as something that is important for some experts and some stakeholders, but something which, when you look at circularity, deforestation, or anything here, very important issues that need urgent, massive action at the level of what's at stake. With Towards 2030 report, we explored the development of digital technologies. And at the end of the day, what matters with those reviews, with the perspective of the SDGs, is pretty simple. We know that if we're in the delivery decade and companies need to accelerate transformation, we wanted to explore digital technologies because we think that a lot, and the combination of a lot of technologies, has the potential to enable companies, policymakers, stakeholders to manage complexity and scale differently than what has been possible to date. Hence, technologies and the combination of a lot of technologies displayed, for example, on the screen, but we explored much more of that in our Towards 2030 report, is an interesting avenue to explore to provide solutions that align with what the Agenda 2030 imposes to all of us in terms of rapid transformations of our business models and the way we think about financial activities. In that sense, and that's interesting, because COVID accelerates the digitalization of social interactions, of business processes and business interactions, simply because of the social distance, which has been imposed through lockdown in a very pressing manner across a lot of economies in the globe, across the recent weeks or months for some. COVID does not change anything in terms of what the Towards 2030 report identified, and instead accelerate the need to explore technologies. And of course, we're perfectly aware that technologies do not exclusively generate positive outcomes, but with Towards 2030 report, we've explored a lot of the ethical and, for example, the not necessarily climate-friendly solutions that could be generated using more technology. And actually, as a matter of fact, interestingly, quantum computing, explored here as one among many other technologies, so the list that is displayed on the screen is just illustrative. It shows that basically when we look at the future and just in 5 years from now, we don't really know how many of the technologies will be used, and how at the end of the day, quantum computing, as an example, is something that is exponentially developing and something that might generate ways to enable broader dissemination of technologies that would be with low carbon footprint, which is different from what is happening today, for example, with the development of 5G. So we're perfectly aware of those stuff. Again, Towards 2030 is a report that you can download on our website in the publication section, and an executive summary of something like 5 pages provides just a digest of it if you want to just look at that. Last, in terms of context, when we look at what SDG washing might look like and how to avoid SDG washing, looking at the decade of turbulence ahead of us, we explored with Towards 2030 report several 13 innovative finance solutions, which we believe can enable to mobilize funds, finance, to serve programs with big positive environmental, human rights, ethical, social impact. And of course, again, it's a combination. It can be a pure innovation from a financial product perspective, as much as it can come as a combination of an innovation from a product perspective using different technologies, ensuring better dissemination and capacity, for example, to reach people who need access to financial solutions, to invest in practical equipment, for example, enabling them to transition to low carbon activities, just as a random example. So at the end of the day, when we talk here again about COVID, we look at that and we say, well, interestingly, a lot of liquidities have been poured to support many economies in the world as we speak, and to mitigate recession. And a lot of those make even more urgency to address a lot of the carbon human rights related, good job, decent job issues, for example. In many Agenda 2030 goals that can be supported by even more liquidities. I talk here with caution because, of course, a lot more liquidity is pouring to support finance of programs with positive impact from an environmental, social, and ethical perspective might change given the big recession that is ahead of us. However, at the moment when we speak, COVID overall amplifies the need for more innovative approaches, leveraging financial solutions, clearly. Where, as we speak, for example, working a lot on programs and discussions related to hunger, because we see that because poverty is growing, a lot of funders are exploring, as we speak, solutions to enable, to activate or mobilize some funds to enable people who are increasingly in hunger risk, even in OECD economies and not necessarily exclusively in emerging economies, to explore what solutions can be brought to them using some of the technologies that are available as well. So COVID amplifies, COVID makes the urgency even more pressing. And at the end of the day, doing or working on SDG washing today does not really change much from what we could say about it a few months ago. Few conclusions, which in a really washing perspective, are displayed on the screen as we speak. We a decade where fast transformation is needed, and COVID has showed many businesses that they were extremely vulnerable, so they need to think in agility differently, for example, and resilience. We know that companies are lagging behind in terms of capacity to invest in programs which are at the scale of where the Agenda 2030 is. Environmental and ethics or all of those sustainability topics. And we know that technologies and innovative finance are clearly interesting to explore and leverage to amplify programs. And COVID, in that sense, is more a catalyst than anything else. So moving on to learning from COVID-19 and the way we can look at SDG washing. What we've learned, and this is derived from one of the blogs that has been released recently on our blog section that is accessible on ksapa.org in our publication section, and it's open source. We believe that interestingly now, increasingly a lot of experts or think tanks are asking, for example, to think differently how supply chains are localized. And of course, an idea is to decrease dependency upon, for example, sourcing from China, or from whatever region in the world. That might, of course, make sense. However, because COVID-19 is proving that by the end of the day, we can all face what we call a black swan, meaning that we can plan as much as we want, but at the end of the day, there are things we just don't know. Principle number one, exploring SDG and SDG washing risk is agility, meaning that at the end of the day, today, what matters is not necessarily to define with high certainty how business will look like in 2025 or 2030 or whatever, but it's instead agility and ability to know how to adapt to uncertainty. A point that is very important here to address these questions is how we can approach in a very robust manner the SDGs is clearly the concept of being in collective approaches. meaning that we know that because the agenda is big, because what each of us can do is not enough, at the end of the day, thinking in collective terms is important. And the more we're selfish, the less we're successful. The more we think through collective approaches, the more we are meaningful and impactful. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is basically that the more anyone would take positions on SDGs that shows how, from a selfish approach, they can approach big things, the less they will be credible and they will likely be impactful. The more each of us is able to position activities and programs and thinking in a broader ecosystem, the more we are pertinent. Point number 3 that we wanted to display here is the concept of transparency, simply because there is what we know, there is what we don't know. And if science, for example, is pretty clear, if we look at the climate, for example, there is what we know and there is what we don't know. I would give you an example, a recent article released by Nature shared more than 400 expressions of climate on business, and on not only business, but on how climate can impact a lot of our activities, 400 plus. That means that this is something we can say we know, but it also means that in a few years from now, that will not be 400, that will be 600. And so if we look at that, addressing the question of SDG washing means that we need, in a credible manner, to be transparent about what we know and how best we can commit to address the risks or the opportunities we're talking about based on what we know. And we need to be transparent about the level of understanding and the maturity we have on topics. And that's how we can calibrate in 2023, 2025, or whenever, what we know to be able to calibrate what we can do. And SDG washing, 5 years ago or in 5 years from now, will have to be calibrated based on that, because the level of understanding of what good might look like will be different. Point number 4 here is related to public authority. SDGs in the Agenda 2030 were released as a way to provide a compass, in simple terms, to the whole humanity for each of its stakeholders to take part and contribute to these sustainable development goals. But that basically means that everything should not come from each of those stakeholders. And that basically implies that governments, authorities clearly have a role to play. And this is interesting because sustainability is a topic where a lot of, for example, the corporate responsibility actions date have been to go beyond what law is expecting. And to some extent, for some programs, it's been mostly not necessarily in purpose, but partly about giving authorities and governments kind of a peripheral role on a lot of issues. And that's a big mistake. Never forget, for example, that on the human rights agenda, business has a role to respect human rights, but governments, at the end of the day, have a role to ensure that that basically human rights are applied. So stakeholders and public authorities particularly clearly have a role to play. And on SDG washing, the question is what we do with those gray areas between how far private sector can go and where to challenge also public authority, which clearly has a role to play. And the 5th principle here that can be shared to provide more context about SDG washing is to maintain a readable, credible thread of action where the short term and the long term can connect together. I'll give a few examples. If it's about addressing, for example, circularity and plastics and managing COVID, what does that imply in terms of long-term commitment, for example, to say we want to commit to zero waste, zero plastic waste, and on the short term, manage, mitigate dissemination of COVID using potentially more single-use plastic packaging or whatever. This is exactly a very concrete example about navigating conflicting injunctions. A solution, and I'm in discussion about that in the program, basically to amplify, for example, circularity programs as a kind of mode that is halfway between zero waste and at least a way to maintain or to decrease pollution that can be generated in the short term. There are many other better, more practical solutions, but at least the fifth point here is all about ensuring that short-term injunctions can still align and remain credible looking at longer-term injunctions. Just think that at some point I pause here half a second to ensure that for everyone taking part in this webinar, we're clear when we talk about SDGs and about what SDG washing might be. We're surprised, but we work with some partners ourselves, which conduct regular surveys exploring how opinion across a good number of economies, and I'm thinking of the US and a couple of markets in Europe, for example, France, Germany, UK, know something about SDGs. And at the end of the day, the penetration is not that high. So for those taking part in this webinar, I strongly suspect that you're all experts or have clear understanding, but it's never bad to remind that actually we're talking about an agenda for 2030 that has been put in place a few years ago that provides 17 priority themes, and online you can go deeper within each of these themes. And at the end of the day, the idea is to say that those are the priorities and could be looked as a kind of compass for business, for stakeholders of every corner of our societies to contribute to build more just and sustainable societies by 2030. And SDG washing is basically no less than a situation when an organization is developing activities, programs, and claims only at the margins of the issues to adorn oneself with major principles. I would give an example. If it's about, I'm a food company and I consider that SDG 3 is important, SDG 3 is being about good health and well-being, well, if at the end of the day, 99% of my portfolio is about junk food that increases cardiovascular diseases, obesity, and other issues, and 1% of my portfolio is about good nutrition solutions, there is clearly a problem of SDG washing, as a concrete example. However, and I think that's a very important point to be constructive approaching these questions of SDG and SDG washing, I think we should not be judgmental. And if I take my example, I think the journey is as important as the fact. If I'm a company and I say that 99% of my portfolio is not good food, but at least I commit, and then I will share 5 concrete and practical principles to walk the talk that I'm talking about here, to improve step by step, and moving with the objective to say that, yeah, I'm not good today, but in a few years from now, 100% of my portfolio will be aligned with SDG 3. That's a different story. And I think that's important to frame that in those terms, because it's easy to be judgmental. It's easy to treat everyone we want about SDG washing, but at the end of the day, none of us, and I really believe that none of us is good. We can all improve. So SDG washing must be constructive and led by very concrete criteria towards a common objective. If it's all about putting some people aside, this is not how we are going to build collectively some more just and sustainable society. Let's not be judgmental. Let's encourage everyone to be better. So here are the 5 principles that are very concrete in terms of criteria, which we suggest to use. And those principles are extracted from a briefing paper about SDG washing, which was released on our website last year, which you can download for free on our publication section. Principle number 1 connects strongly with the concept of materiality and strategy. It's all about being focused on priorities strongly aligned with the core business of the company. again, with my example of food company, if my core activity is basically to be a food company, producing producing recipes and food products, which I'm selling to consumers, well, at the end of the day, what matters is to select the 1, 2, 3 SDGs here, which are really core to my business, 1, and 2, to ensure that there is the best alignment across everything we do in the company to align with those objectives. Everything we do means, in simple terms, that we can explore how to factor the SDG vision or commitment in the way we innovate and design products, how we produce differently, how we source and procure raw materials and other input material differently and more aligned with the objective, how we engage, educate consumers or clients differently to ensure that along all of those aspects of our business model, we know what is attached to our core activities and ensure that we become increasingly aligned and consistent with the priority SDGs, for example, good health and well-being, which we can select for our company. If you don't know how to address those questions of materiality and strategy, we have on our at Ksapa.org on our publication section to our blog and multiple briefing papers, multiple sources of information that you can explore for more information. However, principle number 1, are the SDGs we're talking about aligned with our core business? Principle number 2, what long-term strategy is defined? And this aligns with, if I take my example of food company, this can align in simple terms with a purpose and a vision that is strongly correlated with the SDGs, which can be defined for a company. We want, for example, to promote good health and well-being. And what are the implications for that across our activities? And what can be our commitment in terms of targets to support that? And remember, a bit earlier, I shared the question of currency as part of the kind of contextual element that will make approaches to SDG and SDG washing credible. I think here, the question is having a long-term strategy that can be supported by a calibration of objectives that need to be updated on a regular basis based on what we know about what science has to say, what we know about, for example, what our stakeholders are expecting from us. So there is no reason to define in 2020 some fixed objectives and ambition for the programs that are here to stay for years. Instead, that might become SDG washing if in a few years from now, we discover that at the end of the day, the ambition is not aligned with the pressure that should necessarily be coming from external stakeholders from an organization. Here, I would take just a minute to share an example coming from climate. I was working myself a lot on climate strategies a decade ago, and even more than that. But let's say that in 2010, I was working pretty hard on a lot of climate strategies. And many of those were defined based on what we knew at that time. And many of the targets that we could define for 2015 or 2020 were considered by many internal stakeholders of the companies I was working with to be super ambitious and bold, and in some cases impossible. The truth, and that's an interesting experience to share, the truth is when I look at that in 2020, I discovered that many of those targets defined back in 2010 were at the end of the day not that ambitious. Many of the companies have been way beyond the targets they defined for themselves. And based on what we've discovered from science in between, first, companies have been able to achieve targets beyond what they committed back 10 years ago. And second, that's just not enough, and clearly not enough based at least on what the Paris Agreement is expecting for companies to contribute to a trajectory going all the way down to 1.5 degrees. So at the end of the day, I think this expense can be shared and applied to this point number 2 in a very similar manner. Being able to define a long-term strategy become a risk of SDG washing if not able to remain flexible and calibrate it on a regular basis in a transparent manner with what we know and what's expected, I would say, from the market, from stakeholders, and what good can look like in a given point in time. Point number 3 to avoid SDG washing is to focus on priority SDGs on the one hand, and at the same time, recognize the link between SDGs and demonstrate an ability to mitigate negative effects that might impact non-priority SDGs. If I take again my example of let's say food company, and let's say that I want to work on climate action, and because I want to work on climate action, and at the same time I'm interested in zero plastics, I might conclude that some of the good things I can do is to invest massively in vegetal packaging solutions. You know, some of those plastic-like packaging solutions, which can be super crispy, by the way, if you know what I'm talking about in some examples, and are often coming from corn, wheat, and other derivative components of agriculture. Of course, from a pure climate action perspective, and if you look at that also from protection on biodiversity and zero plastic pollution perspective, it's great to explore those solutions. And my point is clearly not to say that that should not be something to explore. However, never forget that they might be in competition with other needs to use land, for example, to grow crops that can serve nutrition and the feeding of people. And that might be in conflict with SDG number 2, zero hunger. And in context of COVID-19, where it is very clear, and FAO released, just as we speak, a very recent update on hunger that is likely going to grow significantly in 2020 because of COVID and the recession, it is a very sensitive and critical topic. So SDG washing might come at the moment when priority given to some selected strategic SDGs might generate programs and investments which are made at the expenses of other SDGs, which are considered to be less important, but at the same time might generate very, very negative impacts across those, let's say, secondary SDGs from a core business perspective. So SDG washing calls companies or investors or any stakeholder to have that kind of systemic perspective, connect the dots across SDGs, and ensure to do good, maximize transformations on the good things, on the positive transformation they can do, and at the same time, keeping an eye on the negative aspects to mitigate those the best they can. And of course, it's complex. The SDGs themselves are complex, not necessarily easy to translate in concrete business or practical objectives and targets, but that's really part of the challenge and part of what's needed to avoid SDG washing. Point number 4, that can build strong SDG washing risk is the moment when there is a complete absence of feedback that on past performance, learning from successes and failures, which are basically basing the current and the future performance on whatever goals and programs that companies can define. With the Toward 2030 report, I mentioned that among the 6 priorities defined, we have one that is called deforestation, as an example. I'm very aware of many companies which committed back in 2015 to work on a zero deforestation target for 2020. I am not aware of any company which has been able to meet that goal in 2020. At a time when, if you remember, we had a good number of deforestation-related crises in 2019, in Amazonia, for example, in Australia. So deforestation has proven, of course, there are strong correlations that can be made between pandemic and COVID-19 and deforestation, apparently. So there are many reasons to believe that deforestation is important. So if I'm a company, for example, or if I'm an investor, because in the, following the, for example, the Amazonia fire, many investors said, well, we want to ban deforestation issues from where we want to invest. Great. The risk is again, the risk of SDG washing if this cannot be backed up by concrete learning from why so many commitments have failed to date and how investors or companies are learning from those failures to do a better job. And as I said, I don't want to be judgmental about that. It's very easy. We're talking about complex topics. So at the end of the day, the point is not to be judgmental and say that this is SDG washing. My point is to say that you are credible and you are not likely to be in an SDG washing mode if you're able to explain what you're learning from a failure, and it is good to talk and share failure examples, and to explain why you believe that you can commit to new and different targets for the years to come in a credible manner, learning from those failures. And at the end of the day, from a pure Agenda 2030 perspective, I think that sharing failures, what's not been working, is good to be credible yourself, as much as a good way to increase awareness of the ecosystem you operate in. And as I said a bit earlier, SDG washing is all about being selfish and trying to address big issues on your own. So at the end of the day, sharing failures, explaining what's not been working to date is a good way to educate your ecosystem and ensure that everyone can learn from those individual failures and be collectively more, smarter approaching and having impact on the SDG agenda. So SDG washing is there when there is this absence of feedback to build trust in future. The last aspect that we believe is a good way to avoid SDG washing is this concept of moving from a report on performance achieved to date to impact. And impact, I'm talking here about the fact that it's all about we have big data, for example, which are accessible to date and which enable to develop more predictability. And at the end of the day, let's look at climate just as an example that can be pretty complex but simple at the same time. What matters is not necessarily exclusively to just say, well, in 2025, for example, as part of SDG 13 in climate action, we want to decrease by 50% our carbon footprint. But it's mostly and increasingly about using data and big data to back up those commitments with predictability and how performance to date and investments made to increase impact of programs to date is likely going to align with the targets that have been defined. So increasingly, it's about supporting engagement with data, facts, and elements that generate more predictability and more trust in the way investments and programs which are deployed can align with avoiding SDG washing risks. So I'm sharing here this fifth and last consideration, which we believe can help to avoid some significant and critical risks of SDG. And I think there is a lot of complexity in those topics, and as part of a kind of closing remark, I would like to make sure that we are not judgmental on those topics, and that the 5 principles that we've just shared in this webinar are helpful to lead constructive discussion, and of course to challenge your stakeholders, companies, investors, whatever governmental actors you want, because SDG washing is terrible. SDG washing is something that has a very negative impact on the credibility of the whole sustainability agenda. But at the same time, the Agenda 2030 and the global goals is something that we all need. And the context of COVID-19 is even more conducive for a lot of the SDGs, which have been pressing and important to become even more urgent as we speak. So acceleration of solutions is important, and we hope that the way we're looking at the Agenda 2030 and these 5 principles to avoid SDG washing is a good way to drive constructive investments and impact to accelerate programs. If you want to know more about our activities, browse our website, ksapa.org. This presentation is recorded and uploaded on our website in the publication section. And you can share it with colleagues if you want, as much as explore the content that are uploaded in the section as well, if that can be helpful for yourself, for your colleagues, and for others. The contact details displayed in the screen are accessible to all of you. Feel free to contact our team. And we're delighted to have been able to share some ideas with all of you today. Thank you very much for your contribution. And thank you so much for your comments and for your participation in this webinar, which are super positive, super helpful in terms of quality feedback. Have an excellent day or evening, depending on the time zone from where you are joining us today. And we're delighted to be part of a same community advancing SDGs, building a more just and sustainable world. Thank you very much for your attention today.